The air at the Hemlock Farm auction hung thick and heavy, smelling of diesel, dust, and desperation. It was late autumn, 1979. The sky was the color of a dull nickel, and a cold wind whipped across the stripped cornfields, carrying with it the murmurs of men in seed corn caps and grease-stained work coats. They picked over the remnants of Earl Hemlock's life like vultures, their voices low, a mix of pity and predatory calculation. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my canvas jacket, just watching. My name is Jedediah Stone. I farm the quarter section my grandfather broke with a team of mules, and I don't hold with debt. Every machine on my place, from my '68 John Deere 4020 to the old Gleaner E combine, was paid for in cash, earned through sweat and prayer. That made me an oddity, a fossil. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a cheap suit and a loud voice, was trying to work magic on a rusty disc harrow. But the real spectacle, the thing everyone was whispering about, sat off to the side like a beached whale. It was a big bud. Not one of the factory models, but a custom-built monster from the early '70s, a KT450. It was articulated in the middle, with 8 massive tires that came up to my chest. Its paint, once a proud shade of white, was now faded and flaked, revealing patches of rust like open sores. A bright orange foreclosure tag from the bank was wired to the grille, flapping in the wind. A dark, ugly stain of oil had soaked into the dirt beneath its massive Cummins engine. A testament to pride coming before the fall, a voice drawled next to me. I didn't have to turn to know it was Richard Miller. Rich was 10 years younger than me, with a smile full of teeth he'd paid a dentist a lot of money for and a belief that the bank was his best friend. He farmed 1,000 acres he'd leveraged himself to the hilt to acquire, and he drove a new Lincoln to church. Heard he threw a rod right through the block, Rich continued, gesturing with his chin at the big bud. Tried to pull a 30-foot chisel plow through wet clay in 4th gear. More ambition than sense, old Earl. I just grunted, my eyes fixed on the machine. It wasn't just a tractor, it was a monument to an idea. The idea, pushed by men in Washington and preached in the farm magazines, that you had to get big or get out. Earl Hemlock had gotten big. Now he was out. The bankman, a kid named Peterson who looked like his hands had never touched anything rougher than a quarterly report, conferred with the auctioneer. They moved over to the big bud. "All right, folks, here she is," the auctioneer bellowed into his microphone, the sound crackling from the speakers on his truck. "The big one. A custom-built big bud articulated 4-wheel drive. She needs a little TLC, folks, a little engine work, but think of the power. What'll you give me? Who'll start the bidding at 5,000? 5,000 for this mountain of American steel." Silence. The wind howled. A few men chuckled. $5,000 for a boat anchor. 4,000? Give me 4, 3, 2,000 somebody, just to get it started. Rich Miller laughed out loud, a sharp, barking sound. "He ought to pay someone to haul it off for scrap," he said, loud enough for half the crowd to hear. He'd just taken delivery of a brand-new Steiger Panther III, financed over 7 years. He talked about its programmable transmission and air-ride seat, like a boy with a new toy. He looked over at me, a smirk playing on his lips. "Still running that old 2-popper of yours, Jed?" he asked, meaning my 4020. "You can't feed the world with a museum piece." "It's paid for," I said, my voice flat, "and it'll still be running when the paint's worn off that new Steiger of yours." His smirk tightened. "That's loser talk, Jed. You gotta use leverage. Use the bank's money to make your own. It's the modern way." "There's nothing modern about a foreclosure auction," I said, turning my attention back to the auctioneer, whose face was getting red. "All right, folks, let's sell it for scrap value then. What am I bid? $1,000? Do I hear 1,000? 500? Somebody give me $500 for over 20 tons of steel." The crowd shifted. This was the real price, the price of failure. I watched the bankman, Peterson. He looked annoyed, embarrassed. He just wanted this thing off his books. He saw a liability, a worthless asset. I saw something else. I saw a Clark planetary axle, a Fuller 9-speed transmission, and a frame made of 1-inch thick steel plate. I saw potential, buried under a layer of grease and misfortune. The auctioneer was about to give up. Sold for scrap to the iron yard if I don't get a bid. I raised a hand, just a slight lift of my fingers. 600, I said. My voice was quiet, but in the silence, it carried like a gunshot. Every head turned. Rich Miller stared at me, his mouth half open in disbelief. Then he burst out laughing. It was a full-throated, mocking laugh that made my neck burn. 600, the auctioneer squawked, his eyes wide. I got 600. Who'll give 7? Silence. The only sound was Rich's laughter and the flapping of the foreclosure tag. Going once, going twice, sold. For $600 to Jedediah Stone. The gavel fell with a crack that seemed to echo across the empty fields. A wave of murmurs washed through the crowd. What's he going to do with that thing? Jed's lost his mind. $600 down the drain. I ignored them all, walking toward the auctioneer's truck. I pulled a worn leather wallet from my back pocket and counted out 30 $20 bills, cash. Peterson, the bank man, took the money with a look of condescending pity. Good luck with that, Mr. Stone, he said, a little smirk on his face. You're going to need it. As I walked away, clutching the bill of sale, Rich Miller fell into step beside me. Seriously, Jed, what in God's name are you planning to do with that hunk of junk? He said, shaking his head. Use it for a deer stand? It's scrap. The engine's blown to kingdom come. Engine can be fixed, I said, not breaking stride. With what? You'd spend $10,000 on a new Cummins for a tractor that ain't worth $2. You should have put that $600 toward a down payment on something decent. The bank's offering great rates right now. I stopped and turned to face him. Rich, the difference between you and me is that when you see something broken, you throw it away and buy a new one on credit. When I see something broken, I see a challenge. I own my land. I own my equipment. And now, I said, tapping the bill of sale against my palm, I own that. He just shook his head, that same arrogant smirk on his face. You're a dinosaur, Jed. And you know what happened to them. He clapped me on the shoulder and walked off toward his shiny new Ford pickup, laughing to a group of his buddies. I stood there for a long moment, the cold wind biting at my face, and watched him go. I looked at the massive, silent tractor, a steel carcass picked clean by the bank. Everyone here saw a fool and his money. They saw a man clinging to the past while the future was being written in loan agreements and amortization schedules. But before we get into the grease and the gears, before we talk about the nights I spent in my workshop bringing that beast back to life, I have to ask you folks watching this, have you ever been in a situation where everyone, and I mean everyone, thought you were making the biggest mistake of your life? When the whole world is telling you you're wrong, but deep down in your gut, you know you're right. Let me know your story down in the comments, because that feeling, that stubborn, lonely conviction, is the fuel that powered this whole story. Getting the big bud home was a battle in itself. It was 15 miles from the Hemlock place to mine, 15 miles of county blacktop and gravel roads. The tractor was dead weight, a 40,000-pound paperweight. I had my old international pay hauler, a relic from a gravel pit operation I'd bought at an auction years ago. It had a big Detroit diesel in it, but it was old, and this was asking a lot. It took me the better part of a day just to get the thing hooked up. I didn't have a proper heavy haul trailer, just a massive pentel hook on the pay hauler. I had to use 2 heavy-duty chains, crisscrossed for safety, and a solid steel tow bar I'd fabricated in my shop years ago for moving bulldozers. The tires on the big bud were low. I spent 2 hours with a portable air compressor, a little chugging Briggs & Stratton motor filling each one. By the time I was ready to pull out, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the dead tractor look even more monstrous. The trip was a slow, grinding crawl. I couldn't get the pay hauler over 10 miles an hour. The Detroit engine screamed in low gear, the temperature gauge creeping up toward the red. Every time I hit a small incline, the weight of the big bud behind me felt like an anchor dragging me back to hell. I could feel the strain in every bolt and weld of the old truck, cars and pickups stacked up behind me, their drivers laying on their horns, shaking their fists as they finally swerved past. I saw their faces in my rearview mirror, mouths moving, calling me a fool. The whole county was watching Jed Stone's folly on its slow, pathetic parade home. When I passed the co-op, a group of men were standing out front, drinking coffee. I saw Rich Miller among them. He pointed at my rig, and they all had a good laugh. I just set my jaw, kept my eyes on the road, and prayed a chain wouldn't snap. It was well after dark when I finally turned into my own lane. The headlights of the pay hauler cut a swath through the darkness, illuminating my workshop. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a simple pole barn with corrugated steel sides, but inside, it was my sanctuary. My wife, Sarah, came out on the porch, a silhouette against the warm light of the kitchen. She didn't say a word, just watched as I spent another hour carefully maneuvering the behemoth into the barn. The concrete floor groaned under the weight. When I finally shut off the screaming diesel of the pay hauler, the silence was deafening. I stood there in the barn, the air thick with the smell of hot metal and exhaust, and just looked at my $600 prize. It filled the space, dwarfing my 4020 parked in the corner. It looked even bigger, more broken inside. For the next week, I did my chores in a rush, my mind on the tractor in the barn. As soon as the sun went down, I was out there. The first job was to diagnose the patient. I started with the oil. I put a 5-gallon bucket under the massive oil pan and pulled the plug. It wasn't oil that came out. It was a thick, grey sludge, glittering with metal shavings. A sure sign of catastrophic bearing failure. Rich was right about one thing: the engine was hurt bad. I spent 2 nights just clearing the way to get to the engine block. The hood was a massive piece of steel I had to lift off with my chain hoist. The radiator was the size of a door and weighed 1/4 of a ton. I drained the coolant, disconnected the huge 4-inch hoses, and carefully winched it out of the way. Then came the turbocharger, the alternator, the fuel lines, the wiring harnesses. Everything had to be disconnected, labeled with a piece of masking tape and a grease pencil, and set aside in its proper place. My workshop wasn't a place of chaos. Everything had a home. Finally, the heart of the beast was exposed, a Cummins KT 1150 inline-6 diesel engine. 1,150 cubic inches, each cylinder was bigger than a coffee can. This was the engine that powered generators, mining trucks, and locomotives. It was built for work. Pulling the head was a job for 3 men, but I was just one. I used the chain hoist on its rolling gantry, carefully hooking it to the lifting eyes on the massive cylinder head. With a groan of protest from the old bolts, it finally broke free. I swung it over and set it on a pair of heavy-duty sawhorses. The news was bad, but not as bad as it could have been. One of the pistons had come apart. It had scarred the cylinder wall and bent a valve, which in turn had cracked the head. But the block itself, the core of the engine, looked salvageable. The connecting rod hadn't punched a hole clean through the side, as Rich had claimed. Earl must have shut it down just in time. It was a daunting task. A new engine would have cost more than my whole farm was worth in a dry year. A used one was still a king's ransom. Rebuilding this one was the only way. It would take time, patience, and skill. The talk at the coffee shop in town was brutal. I didn't go there much, but Sarah heard it at the grocery store, and our neighbor, old Tom Peterson, told me what was being said. Jed's finally cracked, they were saying. All those years of pinching pennies, and he throws his money away on that scrap heap. Rich Miller was the lead singer of that chorus. He'd tell anyone who would listen that I was a fool, a relic from a bygone era who didn't understand modern economics. He's trying to rebuild a locomotive engine with a set of craftsman wrenches, he'd scoff. While he's covered in grease, I'll be buying the land right out from under him. Sarah was worried. I could see it in her eyes when I came in late from the shop, my hands black with grease that wouldn't wash off, my clothes smelling of solvent and steel. "Jed, are you sure about this?" she asked one night, her voice quiet. "People are talking." "Let them talk," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table, too tired to eat. "Talking's cheap. This tractor is a chance to work my land the way it needs to be worked, without signing my life away to a banker." She put her hand on my shoulder. "I trust you, Jed. I always have. Just be careful." I nodded, looking down at my scarred knuckles. Careful wasn't the word for it. I was being meticulous. I ordered a set of service manuals for the KT 1150 through an ad in a trucker's magazine. They arrived a week later, 3 thick binders full of diagrams, torque specifications, and tolerances measured in the 10,000ths of an inch. Those manuals became my Bible. I spent hours reading them, a mug of coffee in one hand, a highlighter in the other, until I understood every oil gallery, every gear lash, every single step of the process. This wasn't just mechanics, it was an act of faith. Faith in the idea that something broken could be made whole again, stronger than before, by a man's own two hands. The late 1970s were a heady time to be a farmer. The grain sales to the Soviet Union had kicked off a boom like no one had ever seen. Corn was over $3 a bushel, soybeans were pushing $7. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre 5 years ago was now fetching $2,000, and the bankers were telling us it was only going to go higher. The gospel, preached from the Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz himself, was simple: get big or get out. Farmers were told to plant fence-row to fence-row, to borrow against their skyrocketing land values, and to invest in bigger, more powerful equipment. It was a gold rush in the Corn Belt. Rich Miller was riding the crest of that wave. He was the golden boy of the Farmers and Merchants Bank. Every time you saw him, he was talking about another 80 acres he'd just bought, or the new grain leg he was putting up. He traded in his year-old Steiger for the newest model, a Panther 4 with even more horsepower. He bought a John Deere 8820 combine, a massive yellow beast with a 24-foot grain head and a cab so plush it looked like the cockpit of an airplane. He was farming nearly 2,000 acres now, all of it on borrowed money. At the co-op, people treated him like a prophet. They listened when he talked about hedging on the futures market and writing off depreciation. He was the face of modern agriculture, a success story in the making. And then there was me. I was still farming my same 240 acres. When the price of corn peaked, I sold every bushel I had. But I didn't take that money and run to the bank to borrow more. I paid off my operating loan for the year. I bought my seed, fertilizer, and fuel for the next spring and paid in cash, locking in the price before inflation could drive it up further. The rest of it, a tidy sum, I put into a simple savings account at the bank, earning a modest 5% interest. To my neighbors, I looked like a man standing still, or worse, going backward. While they were expanding, I was holding fast. While they were buying new, I was rebuilding old. They saw Rich Miller's new combine rolling down the road and saw progress. They looked over at my farm, saw the same 4020 I'd been driving for a decade, and saw a man who was afraid. A failure, even in the best of times. "Jed, you're sitting on a gold mine," the loan officer at the bank, the same Mr. Peterson who'd sold me the big bud, told me when I came in to make a deposit. "Your land value has tripled. We could lend you enough to buy out the Peterson place next door, get you a whole new line of equipment. You're being too conservative." "I sleep pretty good at night, Mr. Peterson," I told him. "That's worth more to me than another 160 acres of debt." He just shook his head and stamped my deposit slip, a look of pity on his face. All the while, the big bud was slowly, painstakingly coming back together in my workshop. I'd sent the block and the cracked head to a specialty machine shop in Des Moines. They magnafluxed the block for cracks. It was sound. They bored out the one scarred cylinder and fitted it with a new sleeve, bringing it back to the standard bore. They welded and machined the head, good as new. It cost me a fair piece of my crop money, but it was a fraction of the cost of new parts. I ordered a master rebuild kit for the Cummins, new pistons, rings, bearings, gaskets, the works. It arrived on a pallet, 1,000 pieces of a giant puzzle. For months, through that winter and into the spring of 1980, my nights were a ritual of cleaning, measuring, and assembling. I checked every tolerance with a plastigauge and a micrometer. I torqued every bolt to the exact foot-pound specification in the manual. I was building an engine, not just fixing one. I was pouring all my stubbornness, all my belief in doing things the right way, into that mountain of iron. Sarah would bring me out a thermos of coffee and a sandwich around 10 o'clock each night. She'd watch me work, her face a mixture of awe and worry. "It's looking like an engine again," she said one evening in March as I was carefully setting the last piston into its cylinder. "She'll be a good one," I said, wiping a smear of assembly lube from my brow, stronger than she was before. The day I finished the engine was a cool, clear Saturday in April. I'd reinstalled it in the massive frame, reconnected the fuel lines, the radiator, the electrical system. I'd filled the crankcase with 15 gallons of fresh Rotella oil and primed the fuel system, bleeding the air out of the lines until pure, clean diesel dripped from the injector fittings. I checked everything 3 times. I climbed up the ladder into the cab. The seat was cracked, the gauges were faded. I put the key in the ignition. I took a deep breath and I turned it. The starter motor, a beast of a thing, engaged with a heavy clunk and began to turn the massive engine over. It cranked slowly at first, a deep rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. It was building oil pressure. I held the key. A puff of white smoke came from the tall exhaust stack, then another. The engine coughed, a single violent shudder that shook the whole tractor. Then it caught. It wasn't a roar at first, but a low, rumbling growl. Black smoke poured from the stack as it cleared its throat, the sound deepening, growing louder, until the entire pole barn was vibrating with the thunder of 1,150 cubic inches of American diesel coming to life. The concrete floor hummed under my feet. The tin on the walls rattled. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A huge smile broke across my face. I looked out the window of the cab and saw Sarah standing by the barn door, her hands over her ears, but a smile on her face that matched my own. I'd done it. The heart of the beast was beating again. But the work wasn't over. The engine ran, but the transmission was still a question mark, and the hydraulics were a mess of leaking hoses. And outside my workshop, the world was starting to change. On the radio, the news was no longer about record grain prices. It was about a grain embargo against the Soviets. It was about American hostages in Iran. And it was about a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve who was determined to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. The prime interest rate, the rate the banks paid, started to climb. It went from 8% to 10, then 12, then 15. At the co-op, Rich Miller laughed it off. Just a temporary correction, he told his audience of nervous farmers. They'll have to bring them back down. You can't stop progress. But I heard those numbers on the radio, and I felt a cold knot tighten in my gut. I looked at my farm, at my paid-for land and my old reliable John Deere. I looked at the resurrected monster in my barn, its engine now purring with a deep, steady power. And I knew that the good times, the easy credit and the soaring prices were over. This wasn't a correction. This was the calm before the storm. The warm, humid air was being sucked into a thunderhead that was about to break over the heartland. And I wasn't sure anyone but me was preparing to take cover. The spring of 1980 was deceptively beautiful. The fields turned green, the sky was a high, brilliant blue, and the sound of my resurrected Big Bud echoed across my quarter section. I had finished overhauling its hydraulics, replacing dozens of cracked and weeping hoses, and rebuilding the main pump. The Fuller transmission shifted with a satisfying clunk, and the Clark planetaries put the power to the ground without a single groan. I pulled a 28-foot field cultivator, a tool I'd bought for scrap and re-welded myself, and the Cummins engine barely noticed the load. It worked the soil deeper and more evenly than my 40-20 ever could, preparing a perfect seedbed in a single pass. I was covering in one day what used to take me 3. The $600 joke was becoming the most efficient machine in the county, and it didn't owe the bank a dime. Across the fence row, Rich Miller was having a different kind of spring. His new Steiger Panther 4 was a technological marvel, but it was a thirsty one. It burned more fuel in an hour than my 40-20 did in a day, and diesel prices were climbing right alongside interest rates. Then, in the middle of planting, his luck turned. I was out on my tractor one afternoon when I saw the Steiger sitting dead in the middle of his field. The big planter behind it folded up like a wounded insect. A white service truck from the dealership in the city was parked beside it. I saw Rich pacing back and forth, waving his arms as he talked to the mechanic. The next day, the tractor was still there. And the day after that. Old Tom Peterson stopped by my lane on his way back from town. Heard from the boys at the co-op, Tom said, leaning on the door of his dusty pickup. Rich's Steiger blew its main hydraulic pump, took out the whole closed center system. They got to order the parts from Fargo, and the dealer says it'll be $10,000 to fix. $10,000, Jed. Can you imagine? And I could also imagine the interest compounding on Rich's operating loan for every day that his corn wasn't in the ground. He ended up having to rent a tractor from the dealership at an outrageous daily rate just to finish planting, weeks behind schedule. The first crack had appeared in his shiny modern empire. That summer the sky turned against us. A high-pressure system parked itself over the Midwest and refused to budge. The rain simply stopped. The brilliant blue sky of spring became a hazy, bleached-out white. The corn, which had come up so promisingly, began to curl its leaves inward during the heat of the day, a plant's prayer for water. The ground cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. Day after day, the sun beat down, merciless and white-hot. My corn suffered just like everyone else's, but my situation was different. I hadn't planted fence row to fence row. I still had hay ground and pasture for my small herd of cattle. The cows could graze the stunted corn if it came to it. My costs were low, I had no payments to make. I watched my fields wither with a heavy heart, but not with the cold fist of panic that was gripping my neighbors. For Rich, the drought was a catastrophe. He had 2,000 acres of corn burning up in the fields and a mountain of debt that grew whether the rain fell or not. The easy confidence he always wore began to fray at the edges. His face grew gaunt, his temper short. I'd see him at the co-op, arguing with the manager over the price of fertilizer for the next season, his voice tight with desperation. He'd stopped talking about the futures market and started talking about the lack of rain, his eyes scanning the cloudless sky with a desperate, haunted look. The grain embargo held, and the price of corn began to slip. The bumper crops everyone had borrowed money to plant were now withering on the stalk. And even if you had a crop, the price you'd get for it was falling. It was a perfect storm of financial ruin, and it was rolling across the plains. That fall, the harvest was a grim affair. Yields were down by half. My old Gleaner E rattled through my fields, bringing in just enough to see us through the winter and provide seed for the next year. I sold my calves at a decent price, which helped. We were bruised, but we were solvent. Rich's harvest was a disaster. His massive 8A820 combine, with its air-conditioned cab and stereo, was cutting through corn that barely came up to its axles. He had to run it day and night, burning expensive fuel to harvest a crop that wouldn't even cover his operating loan, let alone the payments on the machine itself. The final blow came in November. The bank, which had once treated him like a king, sent him a certified letter. They were adjusting the interest rate on his loans. His variable rate mortgage, the one he'd used to buy all that land, was being pegged to the new prime rate. It jumped from 9% to over 18% overnight. His payments doubled. The foundation of his empire, built on the shifting sands of easy credit and rising land values, had begun to liquefy. He was standing on ground that would no longer hold his weight. The winter of 1981 was a long, cold silence. The usual cheerful banter at the coffee shop turned to hushed, worried whispers. The price of land, which had been the bedrock of everyone's wealth, started to fall. It didn't just slip, it collapsed. Land that had been worth $2,000 an acre couldn't find a buyer at $1,000. Banks that had loaned money based on that inflated value were suddenly exposed, their loans unsecured. They panicked. That's when the letters started arriving all over the county. Letters from the bank, printed on cold, impersonal letterhead, demanding that loans be paid down. Notes were called in. Farmers who had never missed a payment in their lives were suddenly told they were over-leveraged, that their debt-to-asset ratio was out of line. The rules of the game had been changed in the middle of the fourth quarter. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the legal section of the county newspaper like obituaries. First it was the young guys, the ones who had just gotten started. Then it was the established farmers, men who had taken over from their fathers, men who had followed the advice of the bankers and the government and expanded. Earl Hemlock's auction had been a warning shot. Now it was a full-scale barrage. The auctioneer's truck became a common sight, a hearse for family farms. I kept my head down and worked. I spent that winter in my shop, tuning up my own equipment, doing repair work for neighbors who could pay me in firewood or a side of beef. I didn't have to worry about letters from the bank. The only mail I got was from Sarah's sister and the seed catalog. Rich Miller's downfall was as spectacular as his rise. He fought it, of course. He tried to sell off some of his newer land to cover his debts, but there were no buyers. He tried to refinance with another bank, but no one would touch him. He was a poster child for the very risk they were now desperately trying to shed. The brand new Steiger, the one he'd traded for after the Panther IV's hydraulic failure, was the first to go. The dealer repossessed it right out of his machine shed. Then came the 8820 Combine. The final auction was scheduled for a bitter cold day in March of 1982. It was almost 2.5 years to the day since Earl Hemlock's sale. I drove over, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a sense of duty. It felt like I needed to bear witness. The scene was sickeningly familiar. The same crowd of men in seed corn caps, their faces grim, their voices low. The same fast-talking auctioneer, the same bankman, Mr. Peterson. Though he looked older now, his face pale and strained, the easy confidence gone. He wasn't a herald of prosperity anymore. He was an undertaker. They sold off the tools first, then the planters, the discs, the chisel plows. All of it was nearly new, all of it bringing pennies on the dollar. I saw Rich standing off by himself near the barn, his shoulders slumped inside his expensive coat. His wife was beside him, her face a mask of quiet devastation. He wasn't laughing now, he wasn't smirking. He was just a man watching his life be dismantled, piece by piece, for the highest bidder. When they got to the land, a heavy silence fell over the crowd. This was the final cut. They started with the parcels he'd bought last, the expansion properties. They sold for less than half what he'd paid for them. Then the auctioneer's voice changed. "All right, folks, now for the home quarter, the original Miller farmstead. 160 acres more or less, with a 2-story farmhouse, a good hip-roof barn, and machine shed. A fine, fine piece of ground, folks. Who'll start the bidding for me?" This was the heart of it, the land his grandfather had homesteaded. I watched Rich. He closed his eyes, unable to look. This was the moment his legacy died. A few bids came from the back. A lawyer representing an out-of-state insurance company, a local speculator. The price crept up slowly, painfully. It stalled at a number that was an insult to the generations of work that had been poured into that soil. The auctioneer tried to work his magic. "Folks, this is the Miller Century Farm, good black dirt. You won't find a better piece of ground in this county." But the money was gone, the credit was gone, the confidence was gone. "Going once," the auctioneer said, his voice flat. I looked at Rich, at his wife clinging to his arm. I thought about my own farm, the land my grandfather broke. I thought about the smug look on Rich's face at the Hemlock auction, the laughter. But I felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sorrow. This wasn't a victory, it was a tragedy. He had been wrong, arrogant and foolish, but he was still a neighbor. I raised my hand. "I'll bid," I said, my voice clear and steady. I named a number $10,000 higher than the speculator's bid. A gasp went through the crowd. Every head turned to look at me, the man with the old tractors and the dinosaur ideas. Rich's eyes snapped open. He stared at me, his face a storm of confusion, disbelief and shame. Mr. Peterson, the banker, looked like he'd seen a ghost. The speculator shook his head and dropped out. The insurance company lawyer conferred with someone on a cell phone the size of a brick, and then shook his head too. "Going once," the auctioneer called out, his eyes locked on me. "Going twice." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "Sold." The gavel cracked, the sound echoing in the cold March air. "To Jedediah Stone." I walked to the clerk's table, my legs feeling strangely light. I didn't have a loan pre-approval. I didn't need one. I pulled out my bank book, the one with years of careful savings from good crop years, and showed it to Mr. Peterson. He looked at the balance, then up at my face, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something that looked like respect in his eyes. He just nodded, his throat working. I didn't go over to Rich. There was nothing to say. I just got in my old truck and drove home. I hadn't bought the land to gloat. I'd bought it because it was a good piece of ground, and it shouldn't be owned by a column of numbers on a corporate ledger in Chicago. I'd bought it because a man's home, his grandfather's home, deserved better than that. The years that followed were hard, but they were honest. The farm crisis scoured the countryside, taking the leveraged and the unlucky. But for those of us who were debt-free, it was a time of opportunity. I farmed Rich's old home place myself for a few years. The Big Bud, which I'd named the Survivor, made it possible. Its power and efficiency meant I could handle the extra acres without hiring help or buying more equipment. It pulled a bigger planter, a wider cultivator. It was the right tool for the job, and it was mine. A few years later, when things had settled down some, I ran into Rich at the hardware store. He looked older, his hair graying at the temples. He was working a job in town, managing the grain elevator. He'd lost the Lincoln and the arrogant swagger, but he seemed quieter, more solid. He walked right up to me. "Jed," he said, sticking out his hand, "I never properly thanked you." I shook his hand. It was calloused again. "Nothing to thank me for, Rich. It was a business decision." He shook his head. "No, it was more than that. You bought my family's home. An insurance company would have bulldozed the barn. You saved it. My boy, he asks about it sometimes, asks if we can go back." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool, Jed. I thought you were the one who was stuck in the past. Turns out you were the only one who was looking at the future." "The bank was selling a good story," I said. "A lot of people bought it." "Yeah, well you didn't," he said with a wry, sad smile. "Listen, if you ever think of renting the place out, my wife and we'd be interested. I could farm it on the weekends, just to have my hands in that dirt again." And that's what we did. I rented him his own farm back for a fair price, a simple handshake deal. He started small, with an old case tractor he'd bought for cash. He was building again, but this time he was building it on a foundation of solid rock. The community changed. The men who had laughed at me at the Hemlock auction now stopped me at the co-op to ask my opinion on equipment. They'd bring over a broken part from a baler or a combine, asking if I could weld it. The definition of a good farmer was no longer the man with the most acres and the newest iron. It was the man whose name wasn't in the foreclosure notices. Success was no longer measured by the size of your loan, but by the fact that you didn't have one. I never preached. I never said, "I told you so." I just kept my head down, did my work, and paid my bills on time. That was sermon enough. My son, Michael, grew up in the shadow of that crisis. He spent his childhood helping me in the shop, handing me wrenches as I worked on the 4020, or did the annual maintenance on the Big Bud's big Cummins. He saw the for sale signs go up on his friends' farms. He saw the stress on the faces in town. One evening, years later, he was a grown man with a son of his own, and we were standing in the machine shed. The Big Bud was parked in its usual spot, its paint faded from years of sun, its tires worn smooth, but its engine still ready to thunder to life. "You know, Dad," Michael said, running a hand over the tractor's massive fender, "I remember when you bought this thing. All of my friends' dads said you were crazy. They said Rich Miller was the smart one." "He was smart," I said, looking at the old tractor. "He just wasn't wise. There's a difference." "He bet on the bank," Michael said. "You bet on yourself." "I bet on this," I said, patting the cold steel of the tractor. "I bet on the idea that a man's own two hands are a better asset than a line of credit, that owning something, really owning it, is the only real security there is. This tractor doesn't look like much to some people. It's old, it's loud, it doesn't have a computer or a GPS, but every nut and bolt on it tells a story. It's a story about patience and hard work, and not listening to the crowd when they're all running in the same direction, because chances are they're running right toward a cliff." My grandson, a boy of 10, came running into the shed, his face full of excitement. "Grandpa, can we start the Big Bud? Please." I looked at Michael and he smiled. I pulled the worn key from my pocket and handed it to the boy. "Go on, climb up there. You know how." I watched him scramble up the ladder into the cab, his small hands on the same controls my hands had known for decades. A moment later, the starter whined, the engine turned, and that deep, familiar rumble filled the barn, shaking the dust from the rafters. Black smoke puffed from the stack before settling into a steady, rhythmic haze. I stood there, leaning against my old workbench, the smell of diesel in the air, the sound of that engine a steady heartbeat. I looked out the open barn door at the field stretching out to the horizon, land that was mine, free and clear. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The world had changed. The bankers had new stories to sell, new ways to promise progress on borrowed time, but out here, some truths remained. The sun still rises, the rain still falls, and the surest thing a man can build his life on is the ground beneath his own feet. The beast in the barn was more than just a tractor. It was a monument to that truth, a $600 testament to the simple, stubborn power of staying free.